My number flashed green, then snapped backward. The guard tugging the rope 2 steps away as the HOA manager slid through in tailored wool, a sealed envelope tilted like a blade in his hand, while I stood in a damp thrift store coat with rain on the cuffs, clutching a scuffed folder and the cold tooth of a key to a lock taped off home. Lemon cleaner burned the air. Fluorescent lights buzzed, and the attendant's trained smile pronounced the list closed the way a velvet rope decides who counts. I carry years in my hands, receipts lined like tracks, photos dated to the minute, and 5 quiet words from an old stranger like a compass. And beside me, my granddaughter steadies the light. The manager's polished shoes click like permission, while my soles squeak on shampooed carpet. The city clock a minute fast over my head, and the smell of dust and lemon telling me to accept my place. Before this night ends, I will make their policy speak and turn that closed sign into the crack of a door. Before we continue, please subscribe and check in below. Where are you tuning in? If this hits home, share it so fewer elders carry this weight. The humiliation started with a number that never turned green. My number blinked on the screen, then slid backward as a new notice rolled across, list closed. The line moved the wrong way. The rope stanchions nudged 2 steps back, and the guard who'd been talking to everyone else found something very important to examine on the floor. I raised my hand and he drifted away, eyes skimming past me like a stone across water. The community center smelled like wet cardboard and lemon cleaner. Outside the glass doors, yellow tape fluttered around my building across the street, and a paper sign with a warning stuck crooked on the lobby window. Inside, the lights hummed, too white for nighttime. I carried my folder clamped to my chest and felt the cold tooth of a key in my pocket, a key without a door tonight. A man older than me had sat beside me earlier, palms folded on a cane polished by years. He'd given me 5 words, not comfort, but direction. I didn't repeat them out loud. I let them settle. I approached the intake desk when the attendant looked up. He had a badge on a lanyard and a practiced smile that didn't reach his eyes. His fingers hopped across the keyboard, then stopped. He glanced at the cue screen, then back at me, then to the guard, who shrugged without meeting my face. "List closed," the attendant said to the monitor. The monitor agreed and told him nothing. Paper curled from the printer beside him, empty of my name. I didn't raise my voice. I shifted the folder to the counter, smoothed the top page with my palm, and asked for a denial in writing. I asked for a protocol number and the name of the person responsible for the action. I requested a supervisor under the posted policy. My hands were steady. The room wasn't. Behind me, the door sighed open and the HOA manager, our building's president, crossed the lobby in a hurry that had no place to go. He passed near enough to brush my sleeve, eyes forward, envelope thin as a blade under his arm. I knew the kind of paper that could stop things cold without ever admitting it had a temperature. I did not chase him. In my pocket, the key pressed against my thigh. The front desk phone rang twice and stopped. The guard repositioned the rope, corralled the line away from me, and then pretended to study the exit map. Ava stood 5 feet back, her backpack against her shins, phone in her hand but screen face down. 16 and careful, she watched for my signal and didn't move without it. I had told her we were going to do this the right way. She nodded once when our eyes met, a little anchor disguised as a child.
The attendant skimmed my first page, then flipped to the second. Reluctant, I watched his lips shape dates silently and saw the little crease appear above his nose when he reached the inspection photos from last week. He wasn't used to people arriving with receipts that had been alphabetized by grief. The clock over the doorway said it was still the same night I started losing things. The second hand sounded louder than it should, tapping the room like a small hammer on a stubborn nail. Somewhere down the hall, a cart rattled and a coffee machine released a sigh that smelled burnt at the edges. Somewhere outside, the police tape thumped against a lamppost, a tired flag without a country. A volunteer with white hair and a windbreaker came to the side of the desk. His hands were inked with the ghosts of 100 sign-in sheets. He ran a finger down a column and found my name. He looked up to see if the person attached to it still existed. I gave him my address, and he nodded, then tapped a bulletin board on the wall, a laminated page crowded with text, the heading about emergency access to personal documents and restricted dwellings. The words were not mine, but they were close enough to the 5 words I was carrying to make a shape. The attendant tapped keys again. He inhaled as if air had suddenly become expensive. I repeated my request, this time with the order right. Written denial, protocol number, name of the responsible party, supervisor notified pursuant to the posted policy. I didn't say please or threaten. I let the posted policy say both. The printer made a sound like a chair being dragged on tile. A sheet fed forward. The attendant pulled it before it finished landing and checked the bottom line as if something might jump off and bite him. The guard shifted his weight and stared at the digital map on the wall like it was a window to a kinder building. I pressed the folder down with 2 fingers and slid the top page so that the timestamps made a straight line across the counter. Rent receipt on the 1st of the month, inspection report from 7 days ago, the preliminary notice from the fire department an hour earlier, the intake note from triage 5 minutes ago. The paper wasn't louder than the room, but it quieted my chest a little. The attendant scribbled his initials on the denial that wasn't a denial yet. He left the name line blank and reached for the phone. He didn't dial. He stared at the keypad as if the numbers might rearrange into an answer that cost him less. A supervisor, I said to the clock, to the policy, to the room that had decided my number belonged behind itself. He picked up the receiver and spoke just below the volume of a mosquito. The words were for the wire, not the air. He hung up and wrote a name with the first letter pressed harder than it needed to be. The printer complained again. He placed a small plastic stand with a number on the counter in front of me, then remembered himself and gestured to the seating area. My number glowed on the screen a few seconds later. It didn't move backwards this time. A radio crackled. Someone said a title that meant boss without admitting power. The guard answered with a noise that could have been respect and could have been indigestion. In the corner, Ava rolled her shoulders and stood up straight, the little discipline that keeps breathing when you need your breath. The volunteer with white hair and a windbreaker came to the side of the desk. His hands were inked with the ghosts of 100 sign-in sheets. He ran a finger down a column and found my name. He looked up to see if the person attached to it still existed. I gave him my address, and he nodded, then tapped the bulletin board on the wall, a laminated page crowded with text, the heading about emergency access to personal documents and restricted dwellings. The words were not mine, but they were close enough to the 5 words I was carrying to make a shape.
I heard the click of a side door and turned. A supervisor stepped out, tired in a clean way, hidden behind a neutral necktie that said nothing because it had been told to say nothing. He examined the stand with my number. He examined me. He examined the folder as if it were going to open its mouth and recite the rules. Protocol, I said to my documents, and he nodded to them as if they had spoken. He took the papers not out of my hands but to the counter's edge and shuffled nothing into a new order. He looked at the denial and corrected the subject line with a pen that had the building's logo worn off. He checked the bulletin board copy against the one the volunteer had placed, and I watched his eyes stop at a phrase in the 3rd paragraph about immediate access to personal identification and medicines under supervision in cases of temporary restriction. He called someone by name, not the guard, not the attendant. The radio answered. A woman I hadn't seen appeared at the far end of the desk with a ring of keys that belonged to doors I didn't need. She held a clipboard like the last piece of a bridge. Outside, the tape snapped in the wind and a siren muttered from far away, a tired dog behind a fence. Inside, the coffee machine coughed again. I could taste the cleaner in the air, lemon climbing the back of my throat, reminding me that life takes whatever smell it's given. The supervisor asked the attendant 2 questions and received a pair of nods that didn't match. He scratched something out, then added the time above it. He circled the time. He pressed the paper with his palm, not to flatten it, but to leave a memory of weight. He lifted the small plastic stand and slotted it back into its rack. My number disappeared from the screen. For a second, I thought I had been erased. Then the gray door behind the desk opened an inch, then two. A breeze cooler than the room slipped through and found my face. Someone beyond it shuffled papers on a table I couldn't see. It smelled less like cleaner and more like dust. The supervisor pointed to the opening and told me with his chin to wait there. He turned to the attendant and said a sentence that included the word confirm twice. The volunteer hovered, not intrusive, not gone. Ava shifted to my side and stood so close I could feel the heat of her arm. She didn't speak. Her silence had good posture. Through the gap, I could see a stack of forms with a bold line near the top for a number that wasn't my number yet. A red stamp lay beside it, angled as if interrupted mid-air and set down by someone who meant to return in a moment. The supervisor stepped through first, then held the door with the flat of his hand. He stopped, listening for something that wasn't sound. He nodded once toward the interior room, then toward my folder. I took one step forward, and a different attendant inside the small office said that my process could not advance without the physical identification card locked upstairs behind tape and a sign that used the word hazardous like it was a person's name. I put my palm flat on my folder to keep my hands from reaching for a door I wasn't allowed to hold. I felt the ridge of the key through my leg, a little tooth against my leg, and I breathed once to find my shape again. The supervisor was still at the hinge, listening to a silence that had become policy.
Behind me, Ava moved into my line of sight without stepping between me and the opening. She stood where I could see her, where the supervisor could see her too, and lifted her phone with both hands. The lock screen showed the time in big numbers. She tapped, swiped, and there I was, the front and back of my identification card, photographed months ago under a kitchen light that had made everything look honest. The images filled the screen, edges square, file dates neat. She didn't say a word. She held the phone like a candle. The attendant inside didn't look. He said the rule again, a little louder, as if volume could thicken a wall that was already thick. The supervisor cleared his throat once. He asked for the posted policy. The volunteer in the windbreaker answered before anyone else. He had never left. He slid in from the side with a copy he had pulled off the bulletin board and set it on the counter between me and the door. I watched the supervisor's eyes fall to a paragraph I already knew by heart. Access to personal identification and medications under supervision when a dwelling is temporarily restricted. The language was clumsy, but it was there. The supervisor traced the line with his pen. The attendant didn't lean forward. He leaned back, the universal posture of, "Not my fault." I spoke to the paper. I asked again for a denial in writing, a protocol number, the name of the person responsible for the action, and a supervisor's review under the posted policy. Each request was a small rung on a ladder I could climb without running. The supervisor looked at my folder not as a favor to me, but as an answer to his own job. The room changed temperature in increments. The guard came nearer, then remembered he had somewhere to stand, and went to stand there. The attendant reached for the printer without looking at it, as if the machine might be offended by eye contact. A sheet came out crooked and warm. He caught it by the corner and flattened it with the side of his hand, his knuckles pale with the effort of pretending the page had always been meant for me. He filled the name line slowly. The pen made a tiny scratch where there should have been certainty. He wrote the time and wrote it again harder. He slid the paper toward me, not far enough to be generous, just far enough to be official.
The supervisor asked him for the log entry. He hesitated. Ava tilted her phone so the digital image of my card threw a white glow across the counter. The volunteer lifted the printed policy and pointed to the line again, like a teacher forcing a lesson to become a fact. The supervisor nodded once. The radio hissed and quieted. The denial became, in an awkward turn of wrist and ink, a notification of temporary limitation pending supervisory review under emergency access. A small change in words that changed the floor under my feet by a fraction. I didn't celebrate. I pressed my folder down with 2 fingers where my receipts made a straight line. Rent paid on the 1st, inspection done a week ago, preliminary notice logged earlier tonight. Ink against laminate, time against time. Ava whispered from her place beside me, not to the supervisor and not to the attendant, just to the air we were using together. She said she had uploaded the images to a shared folder and added the policy photo too. She said the timestamps were visible. She said my name like she was putting it back on a list. The smell of lemon cleaner crawled up my throat and sat there, a citrus stone that wouldn't dissolve. I kept my eyes on the clock above the door and let the second hand hit the minute. The supervisor told the attendant to generate a protocol number. The attendant's jaw worked. He typed. The printer coughed. The number arrived on a strip of paper, plain as a bus ticket. He stapled it to the notification and scrawled his initials like he wanted to make sure no one thought the letters had volunteered. He read the number into the phone so another room could hear that I existed. The guard adjusted the rope stanchions back to where they had been before the night decided to lean on me.
I asked for the name of the person entering the log. The attendant gave it through his teeth. The volunteer repeated it gently so the air would remember without malice. I added it to my own notes on the back of an old electric bill. The paper was soft from having been handled. It took the ink like it had been waiting. The supervisor stepped aside and let the gray door open wider. He told the attendant to notify the small session coordinator. Session, he said, not hearing how the word turned a building full of damage into a meeting room. The wall monitor in the lobby flickered and changed color, then rolled a banner that announced a brief verification session in the community auditorium. My number appeared under a line that said pending review. The lettering wasn't kind, but it had shoulders. I wasn't done. I felt the key in my pocket and knew I needed the city to see itself as a clock, not a door. I told Ava we were going outside for a minute. I told the volunteer we'd be right back. The guard opened his mouth to say something about the rope, then closed it around the word. We passed under the fluorescent lights and into the chill that had been insisting all night that it was in charge. The tape around my building lifted and snapped in the wind like old applause. The warning notice on the glass tilted under its tape, a slant that made the black letters look like they were trying to walk off the page. I held my phone steady and photographed the sign, then the cones, then the clock on the community center's brick wall, its minute hand pinned to the same point as the time on the protocol slip in my pocket. I recorded the corridor of the taped sidewalk, the gap where a stretcher might go, the security light that clicked and never fully came on. The air smelled like wet metal. Somewhere a utility truck made a low sound, idling through its own night. Ava paced the radius, matching my shots with her own, calling out the time softly so the sound was stamped with the pixels already held. She caught the reflection of the warning in the glass door, then turned and took a photo of me holding the folder, because sometimes proof needs a face next to it to remember why it matters. We re-entered through the same doors, and the cleaner smell swallowed us whole again.
The guard lifted the rope with one hand and pretended he wasn't doing it for me. We returned to the counter, and I laid the new photographs beside the printed policy and the log slip. The attendant glanced once and then looked away as if looking made him responsible for the way the world is when it's written down. The volunteer anchored the policy under a paperweight shaped like the building's logo. His fingers were stained faintly with toner. He arranged the pages in the order I would have chosen: policy, protocol, timeline, images. Ava stood on my right shoulder and cued the photos on her phone in the same order, so whoever looked next would not have to think hard to see what belongs where. A murmur ran through the lobby as more numbers appeared on the monitor. The words "brief verification session" returned and then stayed, as if they had found a place in the light they liked. A woman with a clipboard walked by counting chairs without moving her lips. The guard steadied a stanchion, then checked his reflection in the dark screen of the directory map. The supervisor spoke on the radio in sentences that had a beginning and an end. The humiliation line didn't vanish when the papers found their places. It curled around the edges of the counter and the door in the air. The attendant avoided eye contact like it cost him sleep. The guard made a small show of being occupied with the exit route diagram again. The building's manager, the HOA man, reappeared at the far end of the lobby with the same envelope under his arm, its flaps sealed too neatly for a normal letter. He didn't look left or right. He moved like a person delivering weather.
The monitor chimed, and my number rose from pending to called. The doors to the small auditorium sighed open on their own. A flow of people drifted toward the sound of chairs being unfolded and paper being stacked. The volunteer touched my elbow and then removed his hand as if he had never done it. Ava fell in beside me, her breath even, her phone bright. We walked in step with the lobby. The supervisor crossed ahead of us and nodded toward the open aisle, his face neutral in a way that made neutrality feel like a choice he had worked for. I felt the key shift in my pocket, a small weight correcting itself as we moved. At the threshold, the HOA manager's envelope left his arm and entered the secretary's hand just as my number flashed above the stage. The auditorium kept the same air as the lobby, but made it behave. The lights were softer, the hum lower, the smell of cleaner diluted by the old varnish of folding chairs and the dusty sweetness of curtain fabric. My number pulsed on the monitor above the little stage. The secretary received the envelope from the HOA manager and set it down with that careful quiet people use for things they want to matter without admitting it. I kept my folder close and walked down the center aisle with Ava beside me. The carpet had been shampooed recently. Damp fibers brushed the soles of my shoes and left a thin chill climbing through the leather. At the first row, I sat where I could rest my papers on my knees and still see the long table where the minutes book lay open. The red stamp sat beside it at an angle, its wooden handle glossed by 100 hands. I could smell ink before it touched anything. The secretary stacked the night's files into a slope that favored gravity. My folder was new to that slope. The envelope rode to the top on less paper than any of the others. The president of the session tested a microphone with a soft tap that the speakers translated into a tired cough. The clock over the door in this room read 1 minute ahead of the lobby clock. A small difference I felt in my chest like a skipped heartbeat. Time had split, just enough to let doubt step between the numbers. I made my lap into a table and laid the line down as if drawing a map. Rent receipt from the first, inspection report from 7 days ago, preliminary notice from earlier tonight, intake note from triage, the printed policy on emergency access to personal documents under supervision, the protocol slip with my number printed plain, the name of the person who had signed what he first called a denial and then had to rename. I touched each with 2 fingers to press a straightness into a night that kept trying to bend.
Ava took the seat to my right and opened her phone like a book we were reading together. She had arranged the photos to match the paper order and set brightness just below too bright. Her thumb hovered, ready to move forward without racing. The volunteer sat 2 rows back, hands on his knees, eyes on the table. The intern slipped along the wall with a copy of the policy that had been under laminate 10 minutes ago and now lay warm and flexible under a binder clip. He was young enough to still believe rules were written to be read, not to be moved around. The president called the session to order. The sound caught in the cheap speakers, then flattened into the room. He ran down the short agenda in a voice that tried to be brisk without being cruel. Cases grouped by address block, 3 verifications, 1 carryover, my protocol number, and a note the secretary whispered into his ear. The secretary's hand rested near the red stamp, fingertips shining where oil met wood. I watched him align the minutes book with a yellow ruler, the kind you find in drawers where nothing has been measured for years. The envelope left a faint scrape when the secretary slid it across the table toward the president. The flap hadn't been bent. It was one smooth glued line, the kind you seal with pressure and a little intention. The president set it above the minutes book and did not open it. Not yet. The room breathed. I breathed with it. In the back, a camera on a small tripod blinked its red light once as the local stringer adjusted his focus. Nothing flashy. A quiet eye pointed at a quiet table.
I glanced at the clock again and felt the difference between rooms. 1 minute is nothing on a normal day. Tonight, it was a seam, and I wanted to stitch through it. The smell of chairs, the warmth of the paper on my legs, the low burr of the speakers, the slow scrape of a pen cap rolling, all of it gathered itself into a weight I could lift only by doing the thing I had been doing all night: placing, naming, asking. The secretary lifted the first folder, not mine. He read the address, noted a postponement, wrote a new date, stamped something in the margin that did not change anyone's bed tonight. The stamp made a soft thud like a finger on a door you're not sure you're allowed to knock. The president checked the time and called my protocol number. The room didn't move, but something inside my chest did, and I put a hand flat to settle it back into the place where breathing belongs. I stood only enough to lean forward and put my folder within the reach of the table, not past the line you don't cross without being told. The intern stepped close and placed the policy copy beside my papers, the paragraph on emergency access already underlined in pencil. He kept his eyes low, not out of shame but concentration. The volunteer shifted in his chair. The old bones of the folding steel clicked and then went still like a witness deciding when to be a witness. The secretary opened my folder to the first page and read the date. He moved to the second page and read the next date. He stopped at the inspection photos and looked for the kind of mistake a picture sometimes contains in a corner. He didn't find one. He smoothed the policy with his palm and slid it toward the president with 2 fingers, the same way I had placed my documents on the intake counter. The president looked at the paragraph and let out a breath he didn't let anyone hear. I felt the key in my pocket, a small rectangle anchoring me to a door that wasn't a door. The pressure on my thigh grounded me the way a ship's line grounds a boat that would drift if the water were given its way. Ava scrolled to the matching photo and set her phone down so the screen angled toward the table. The light made a pale square on the dark wood. The printed words and the pixel words sat beside each other like siblings who hadn't seen each other in years and suddenly recognized their own nose. The secretary asked for my protocol slip. I handed it forward. He stapled it to his copy and wrote the time again. The pen hesitated on the last number. He looked up at the clock and then at his own wristwatch, and for a moment he was a man who had to admit 2 truths could exist at once. He wrote the later time and drew a small arrow toward the earlier, an arrow so faint I wondered if it would survive a photocopier.
The president turned to speak toward the speakers. His words became shapes that meant acknowledgement and nothing beyond acknowledgement. He referred to the policy without reading it out loud. He named me without looking at me long enough to make it feel like a name. The secretary made notes in a hand that would never win awards, but would always be legible to anyone who wanted to read. The intern kept his gaze on the line he had underlined, as if he could keep the sentence from slipping if he watched it hard enough. Oppression doesn't burn like a torch in rooms like this. It arrives as a series of small weights. It asks you to hold your tongue because no one else is yelling. It moves paper uphill and calls that neutral. It tucks an envelope near the top and calls that standard. It keeps your name out of the air for as long as possible, then uses it once when it can be filed. I felt each weight where my ribs meet, where the old aches sit, where a few bad nights have stored themselves like corns you never spent. Ava steadied me by existing where I could see her. She breathed evenly, like someone laying a warm cloth over a fever. She checked the alignment of the photos again and adjusted nothing. The volunteer kept his hands folded to keep from making any gesture that could be misunderstood. The stringer's camera blinked once more, a tiny heartbeat none of the officials would ever look at because it didn't make sound.
The secretary opened the minutes book to a fresh page, then hesitated. He flipped back 2 pages as if looking for a template. The red stamp was near his wrist. He rolled it upright and then laid it down again, testing balance, like a small animal sniffing at food it knows isn't for it. The president leaned toward him, and the whisper that passed between them left no ink. I placed my line on the edge of the table, page, receipt, report, policy, protocol, in the order that it carried me this far. I didn't move my hand away right away. I let the warmth of my palm transfer to the paper so I could feel that we had both been here. The secretary acknowledged the sequence with a tiny lift of his chin that could have been a reflex or respect or neither. He made a note that included my address and the words preliminary and supervised without building anything out of them yet. The envelope from the HOA manager slid again, 2 inches toward the minutes book. A quiet migration that papers do when pushed by elbows pretending to be elbows. The secretary placed his palm on it. He didn't open it. He didn't push it back. He let it be near. The president raised his hand, and the room held its breath for the ritual that starts everything and sometimes stops it. The secretary dipped his head to the minutes book, squared the corners with that yellow ruler, lifted the red stamp by the handle, and turned it so the rubber could find its line. The clock over the door ticked the minute forward without asking permission. The stamp hovered over my file, ready to fall. If you're still with me, tap like, drop your opinion in the comments and share. Your voice pulls more chairs to this table. The stamp paused in the air long enough for the room to hear it. Then the secretary lowered his hand, not to the corner of my file, but to the margin of the minutes page, where the rubber met paper with a sound like a small, certain heartbeat. He wrote a line that began with my protocol number. He added the time. He marked the presence of the policy copy and named the paragraph by its own clumsy title. The president nodded without speech. The envelope from the HOA manager stayed shut, near enough to cast a thought, but not a decision. I felt the weight in my pocket again, the key pressing through fabric as if trying to be counted among the papers. Ava steadied the glow of her phone so the paragraph remained visible to the table even when no one was looking straight at it. The intern set a paperclip on the policy copy, a practical gesture that read as care. The volunteer slid forward a row and with a slight tilt of his head offered the list of residents for that address block. The secretary reached for it, the way one reaches for a tool already in hand, and entered a notation that my name had been confirmed by an independent roster maintained on site. The president leaned toward the microphone and made the quiet official.
He acknowledged the earlier denial, and then, in the same breath, recorded that the denial would be corrected in the minutes as a temporary limitation to be reviewed under emergency access. It wasn't triumph. It was a line of text moving from one column to another, but the air shook a fraction looser in my lungs. The oppression never leaves a room all at once. It drains like a sink you unclogged with your fingers, slow, with a smell you accept because you can breathe again. The secretary turned to the envelope at last. He pressed the edge flat on the table and examined the flap, not opening it, just reading what the seal said without words. He looked at the top corner where a protocol stamp would have sat if the paper had been logged. The corner was clean. He wrote that down. He placed the envelope to the side of my folder, a separate stack labeled for attachments not in order, and rested his hand on it long enough to leave the sheen of a palm. The HOA manager had taken a seat in the back row, his posture repeating the envelope's posture, closed and angled.
The intern, patient and useful, returned with a second copy of the policy and clipped it to the front of my file. The line about supervised access to identification and medications had a light pencil box around it now. The volunteer raised a finger, not for attention, but for sequence, and offered the small correction that my name appeared on two separate lists, the center's sign-in sheet and the building roster. The secretary entered both, then drew a neat slash between them, a mark that felt like a bridge. The chairs settled. The old varnish smell mingled with the ink's metallic hint. The stringer's camera blinked again, a pin of red in a room that preferred coffee stains and understaffed certainty. The president requested a coordination note from security, and the guard who had been practicing neutrality in the lobby appeared at the side aisle, cap in his hands. He did not speak for long. The line he offered was short and precise. A safe path along the taped perimeter. 2 agents available for a supervised window. No entry to non-essential spaces. Documentation to be checked against the protocol number already on the page. The secretary wrote the words safe path and supervised window, then drew a box around the time column as if making a small room for the minutes to live in until the next hour. Ava's shoulder touched mine. She kept the images in step with the paper. I heard her breathing. Steady, small, a metronome for the night. I took stock of what had closed without closing the night itself. The denial had been pulled back from the ledge and renamed. The policy had come down from the wall and learned to live on a table. My name had been located in ink that wasn't mine. The envelope, without a protocol number, had been filed where it could not block a door. The difference was not a victory. It was scaffolding with weight on it now, able to hold what comes next. The president asked for the time again, and the clock over the door answered with its impartial hands. The minute here had drifted a step ahead of the lobby, but the secretary solved that by recording both. First the room we were in, then the room we had passed through, a careful recognition that the night was not a single instrument. He drew 2 dots between them, as if pairing eyes. I thought of the 5 words the old man had given me on the bench. They did not lift me, they held me level. Ask for the written policy. Not a spell, not a shout, a direction to travel in a place that rearranges its hallways when you arrive. I had followed them into this room, and now the room was writing back. The president closed the book for a moment and consulted a small stack of forms with the supervisor, who had come to the edge of the stage with his tie loosened a half-inch, permission he had granted himself in the time it took for the stamp to land.
They compared the lines in the policy to a checklist used for building incidents. The boxes on the checklist had blunt names: safety, verification, health, and access. And under access, the word essential waited without forcing anyone to imagine what a life could not proceed without. The supervisor drew a line through the middle of that box and wrote identification and prescriptions in small block letters, a human hand teaching a printed sheet how to say what it meant. The guard outlined the route in a few measured phrases: the door along the side corridor, the short stretch under the taped canopy, the steel stairs to the service entrance cleared by the preliminary report, the 3-minute window logged under supervision, the return along the same path. He promised nothing else. The secretary wrote the route in the minutes as if sketching a narrow bridge over cold water. I could almost feel a draft at my ankles just hearing it exist. The HOA manager's envelope remained unopened. The president asked if there was any objection to noting its presence without entering its contents on the grounds that it lacked a protocol stamp. No one objected. The seconds walked their careful circles above us. The intern returned to the wall and replaced the laminated policy he had borrowed earlier with a fresh copy, so the bulletin board would not look bare after giving up the words that had made themselves useful. The volunteer exhaled, a soft cord unwinding.
Ava touched the side of her phone and captured the page of minutes when it lay briefly flat and unshadowed. Not to publish, not to accuse, only to keep track of the night in the same way my folder kept track. Her eyes met mine, and what passed between us was not relief. It was alignment. The plan was now not only in my hands, it was in the room. I listened to the dull shiver of air conditioning find its rhythm again. The stringer packed his camera without drama, the soft rip of Velcro against nylon as modest in its way as any official word. The supervisor stepped back, nodded toward our row once, and moved to the side door where he would count the minutes with his pen. The president reopened the book and read the correction into the microphone, a sentence that turned the earlier mishandling into something with edges smooth enough to hold without cutting. He set the stamp down on a different corner now, not the end of anything, but a marker that said accounted for. The envelope became an attachment scheduled for separate processing. The list of residents remained part of the file. The protocol number sat on the page like a chair ready to be sat in again if someone needed to sit. The session moved on to the next case without ceremony. The rhythm of bodies shifting in seats returned. Paper slid. The microphone found its low cough. I gathered my folder back to my knees, the keys settling in my pocket like a coin weighted to a map. Nothing in the room was warm, but the edges of the pages held heat. The pressure of fingers leaves a temperature you can't see, but can always find. We stood when the president dismissed the brief verifications. No applause, no outrage, just the closed rustle of people returning to their own corridors. I turned with the others and felt the carpet give under my soles, the cool damp of earlier now a faint memory instead of a warning. The volunteer touched my elbow, then let go. The intern offered the copy of the policy that belonged with my file, and I added it to the front where it belonged, the pencil box around the paragraph like a small window cut into a wall. In the hallway, the fluorescent lights reclaimed their authority. The smell of lemon cleaner was back, quieter now, tamed by distance and paper. The guard explained to no one and to everyone that the supervised window would be set from the moment the supervisor clicked his pen at the side door. The supervisor, already there, checked his watch against the wall clock and wrote the minute in a small notebook that looked older than his tie. Ava stood close enough that our sleeves touched.
She tucked a strand of hair behind her ear and opened the shared folder on her phone, ready to add whatever came next to the timeline that had become our night. I placed my palm flat on the cover of my folder and felt the stiffness that comes from having carried the same object through more rooms than it was designed for. We walked together to the exit of the auditorium, where the air from the lobby moved in a longer breath. The protocol slip, the policy copy, the list confirmation, the note about the unopened envelope, the route under supervision. Each piece had found its place. The night had not yielded. It had adjusted enough to fit the truth inside it. I followed the supervisor toward the side corridor. The keys settled in my pocket like a promise I could finally hear. The side corridor held the night like a narrow bottle. Fluorescents buzzed above, and the floor had the slick shine of something mopped more than it was walked. The supervisor checked his watch against the wall clock and clicked his pen in a way that made time into a tool. He wrote the minute down, lifted his chin toward the exit, and we moved.
Outside, cold air pushed against the skin of my face and set a thin salt taste on my tongue. The tape around the block trembled against its metal poles, a dull clack each time it snapped back from the wind. The path had been described in the minutes a few breaths ago, and now my shoes found it exactly. Along the taped canopy, a right turn where the concrete darkened, past a cone that smelled like rubber and rain, and up the steel service stairs. The steps rang under us, hollow and practical. Ava stayed at my shoulder, phone lit just enough to make a circle on the ground, her other hand steady on the rail. 2 agents took their places at the perimeter, their radios whispering names that meant positions, not people. The service door opened on a corridor that had forgotten heat. Drywall dust hung in the air in a way you could taste, and the smell of old water spread itself thin along the baseboards. The supervisor called the minute again and wrote it. He kept the pen uncapped. We passed a cart with a blanket folded on top of a toolbox, and the scratch of the blanket's texture against my sleeve reminded me that fabric can make a sound even when it's still. My door was exactly as I had pictured it for hours, quiet, unhelpful, waiting to be blamed for the problem it had not caused. I put my palm on it. The wood was cool and held no trace of the day. The key in my pocket found the lock without having to try twice. The turn was familiar and private. The latch moved. The supervisor took 1 step forward and paused where his shoe touched the threshold. He gave the pen to the clipboard person, and the clipboard person wrote the second the door met air. Inside, the apartment held the exhale of a place interrupted. A thin film of gray lay across the counter. A stack of mail leaned on itself like tired men. The refrigerator hummed in a tone that had learned to be timid. I walked the path my own feet had worn over a year of mornings and nights, and each step returned a memory, but not a sting. I did not look at the chair by the window where I had left the last light on the night before. I walked to the drawer where the identification card lived and opened it with 2 fingers, quiet, the way you open something that has earned the right not to be surprised. The card lay under a rubber band and a public library receipt. I took it with my thumb and forefinger and put it into the folder in the place I had set aside for it hours ago without admitting it to myself. The supervisor nodded, not to me, but to the list on the clipboard. Medications next. A small bottle. 2, then 3. I held them up and felt the shape of the plastic in my palm, the way the ridges catch sweat and turn it into grip. The clipboard person checked boxes with a small square pen that traded ink slowly, line by line. I found the envelope with the month's bills and added it to the folder. I took the 1 photo I allowed to be in reach, the one of my wife in a dress that looks like afternoon, and let it rest between the policy copy and the protocol slip. The paper warmed immediately, as if it knew how to receive heat and give it back.
The supervisor did not rush me. He did not allow delay. He spoke to the pen, and the pen made a mark, and the mark made the room legitimate. We reversed our path without needing to be told. The door closed, the lock turned. The corridor breathed out a dust smell that did not follow us. The steel stairs answered each step with the same hollow ring. Outside, the tape acknowledged our bodies and settled again. The agent at the perimeter spoke into his radio in the tone of someone confirming a recipe. The supervisor wrote the minute with the click he had promised, then put the cap back on the pen. The window had opened and closed, and the opening existed on paper in a way no one could unfound.
We returned along the taped canopy back into the building where the cleaner and coffee smells resumed their old argument. The guard by the rope stanchions looked at the floor, then at the space above my shoulder, then at the supervisor. The supervisor looked only at the clock. We walked into the auditorium while the chairs still held the warmth of bodies that had left them. The president had not moved far. The secretary opened the minutes book to the page with my protocol number and smoothed it with the back of his fingers in a gesture that had become, in this room, a benediction. The supervisor gave his report to the table in the format the table understands. Minute opened, route followed, items verified against list, identification card placed in custody of person named, medications in original containers returned without incident, minute closed. He did not add adjectives. The secretary wrote the words as if they had always been meant to land on that page. The intern held the policy copy where its boxed paragraph caught the light. The volunteer leaned forward until the steel in this chair clicked softly, then leaned back, the sound of a spring permitted to rest. The president read a correction into the microphone, not for cameras, but because this room talks to itself that way. He acknowledged the mishandling at intake and recorded that staff would receive a refresher on emergency access requirements with immediate guidance posted at the desk until the training took place. He instructed that the laminated policy be reprinted with the emergency paragraph highlighted in a darker bar so a human hand could find it faster. The secretary wrote those instructions into the minutes with small boxes beside them that could be checked with ink instead of hope. The envelope the HOA manager had delivered sat where it had been placed earlier. The president noted for the record that it lacked a protocol stamp and would therefore be logged as an attachment with no power to affect tonight's proceedings. He directed that the HOA submit any future communications through the clerk's office with proper logging, and that an acknowledgement of receipt would be issued to the submitter, not waived at the room. The HOA manager in the back row lowered his shoulders by a measurable degree. The secretary marked the line that made that posture into a decision. The attendant from intake arrived at the aisle, thin with the kind of worry a person wears when he knows his name is already on paper. He provided the log entry needed for the earlier moment, initials compact and legible, and accepted the supervisor's instruction to align his steps with the policy until the formal refresher. No performance, no scene. A line made right because it was written down that way. The guard set the rope stanchions to neutral position and recorded at the secretary's request the times they had been moved. He looked at the map on the wall as he spoke, then looked at the room instead. Ava stood next to me with the same patience she had offered in the hallway, at the desk, on the sidewalk. Her breathing stayed even. The glow of her phone softened. She closed the shared folder and slipped the phone into her jacket pocket, hands free now that the night had learned how to hold its own evidence. She rested her arm against mine, and I felt the press of bone and warm skin, and understood that this weight
was the only weight that asked nothing from me except that I breathe and stay.
The president asked if there was any further business on my protocol number. The secretary shook his head once, small and sufficient. The president closed the minutes book long enough to press his palm against the cover, then opened it again to the next line. The stamp came down in a corner reserved for closure that is not dismissal. Ink kissed paper. The sound was the smallest sound a room can make and still be heard. I placed the folder on the edge of the table for a heartbeat and took it back. The plastic of the identification card inside had cooled to the room's temperature, but the photo next to it kept the warmth of my hand. The policy copy, boxed in pencil, sat on top like a roof. The protocol slip lay visible under the clear pocket, a number that would always be my number on this night. We left the auditorium quietly. The volunteers gathered signs. Staff pushed chairs toward a closet on squeaking rollers. The guard held the door long enough for us to pass and then allowed it to swing shut. The hallway's light was a shade brighter than before, or maybe my eyes had learned something. At the bench near the front, the spot where the old man had sat earlier waited with the same wooden slats, the same faint creak when a body accepts it. I sat for a breath. The building's hum found a low note that fit the night we had earned. The clock above the door looked back to the lobby's time again, as if the two rooms had decided to agree. The weight in my pocket no longer asked to be counted. It belonged where it was. I stood, and Ava stood, and we walked toward the cold air with papers that now had a place in the world, not just in my hands. The city had not changed its face, but it had said my name out loud in the way that matters here, in ink, on paper, in the minutes of a room. I asked for the rule in writing, and the door opened. When we make the rule speak, the wall remembers it was built to hold a doorway. If you valued this story, please like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments what you would do in my place. Until the next story.